The way this family just displays a fire extinguisher on a shelf along with all the picture frames tells you all you need to know. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainely Movies. Today I'm going to be talking about the 2022 sci-fi horror remake, Firestarter. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Firestarter stars Ryan Keira Armstrong, Zac Efron, and Michael Greyeyes, and was directed by Keith Thomas. Based on the 1980 Stephen King novel of the same name, it tells the story of pyrokinetic Charlie, played by Ryan Keira Armstrong, who's on the run from a government agency that wants to study and harness her powers. Another Stephen King movie, another review. Living in Maine, it's pretty much a given that I love Stephen King. So even though the 1984 Firestarter is definitely not one of my favorite adaptations, I was looking forward to seeing this version. My expectations weren't exactly high, but I figured the bar was pretty low and it wouldn't take all that much to improve upon the previous version. So I strolled into the Thursday night preview screening and was met by a completely empty theater. This is Maine, so it's not unheard of to be the only one in the theater. I've had the joy of this experience a couple dozen times over the years, usually at a weekday matinee for a lesser-known film. But for a Thursday night preview screening? Never. And especially not for a new Stephen King movie in a theater literally in the man's hometown. Bangor usually goes all out when a new Stephen King movie hits the screen, but it's like nobody even knew it was out, so I had the theater to myself. Like I said before, I'm not the biggest fan of the original Firestarter. It's alright, and has some fun practical effects that get pretty wild and out of hand towards the end, but it's a film that's far more dull than it should be given the story, and has some supremely wooden performances. I know this 1984 version has its fans, and if you're one of them, I'm happy for you. But it's one of those 80s Stephen King movies that was ripe for a remake. Just maybe not this remake. To be fair, I'd say this 2022 version is a slight improvement over the 1984 one. I think having that comparison in mind might have made me a little more forgiving of this remake than I probably otherwise would have been. People without that comparative frame of reference probably won't be so kind. As was the case with the 84 version, this is a Stephen King novel that proves difficult to adapt. Part horror, part paranoid thriller, part family drama and coming-of-age allegory. It's an odd mix that feels even more odd in movie form, never quite nailing down its identity, which makes a reasonably simple on-the-run story tough to latch onto. Firestarter is the type of Stephen King story that's less about the plot itself and more about the characters and their internal thoughts and motivations. Easy for a book, but super hard to convey in a film. And so this movie just goes for the plot, while largely skimming over the character struggles, which makes the story feel a bit empty. It may be a little empty, but I will say that this version's story feels a good deal more coherent than the 84 version. It does a better job of establishing the shop and the Lot 6 trials, and the extended first act provides a bit more information and characterization, rather than just immediately throwing us into a big long chase without any context like the original. The extended first act gives us more time to see the family dynamic before the meat of the story really kicks in. We get a bit more with Charlie's mom this time around, but as with the 1984 version, this is more of a father-daughter story. That relationship gets played up during the first two acts, and even though it's not stellar, I do think it's an improvement over the oddness of the original. Zac Efron is a bizarre casting choice for a father role, but he works better than you'd expect. And Ryan Keira Armstrong is also reasonably solid as Charlie. This is a slightly darker take on the character. Armstrong is a few years older than Barrymore was, which changes things up a little bit. She's less blubbery and more hardened and aware of the situation, losing that kid innocence that permeated the character in the previous version. It's not necessarily a bad thing, just different. But they did try to keep a few things the same, including some of the costumes. There's a fun little throwback to Charlie's all-denim outfit from the 84 version. The story is more coherent, and the film is much shorter, so the pacing's improved, but the script and dialogue are pretty rough. The film jumps around haphazardly at times, and there are also a number of characters introduced that have questionable purpose in the story. And oh man, the editing. It's noticeably bad in certain sequences, especially early on, and also extends to some very confusing scene transitions. Luckily, the visual effects are pretty decent. The CG work is fine, but there are some particularly gruesome practical and enhanced practical shots. They're few and far between, but they'll make you cringe a bit when you see them. Charlie's powers are fun when they get going, but things never quite reach the levels of effects insanity that the original film treated us to. On the technical side, the best component was actually John Carpenter's driving score, which immediately conjures thoughts of the 80s, though in a very different way than the Tangerine Dream score of the original. This Firestarter remake isn't the next It, and those viewing it without having seen the original will likely be let down, but as a comparative second shot at the story, this one's okay. Not good, but also far from unwatchable. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one is the score. There's just something unsettlingly comforting about a good horror score, isn't there? This film features a score far above its quality level, with a collaboration between John Carpenter, Cody Carpenter, and Daniel Davies. This driving, synthy piano and guitar score is sure to make you think of other similar scores with its very 80s vibe, which surprisingly works, especially during the opening credits and the stylized third act. It's an excellent score, though I honestly think it may be a little too energetic and pounding for this particular story. It almost feels like it should have gone to a different, better project. The second pro is the first act. Now, this is one where I think people who haven't seen the original film will disagree with me. The first act is certainly a bit slow, taking its time to establish the McGee family and lay the groundwork for the shop and the Lot 6 trials. It's not action-packed, and it's not horror-filled, so if you're looking for excitement and inferno right off the bat, you're gonna find yourself a little bored. It's not an excellent first act in the grand scheme of all of cinema or anything, but when compared to the '84 version, the time taken on the first act does wonders for making the story much more coherent from the get-go. On the con side, the biggest issue is the script. Like I just said, I think the first act is a pretty big improvement over the original version, but I certainly wouldn't go as far as to say the script is actually good. Characterization of anybody besides Charlie and Andy is non-existent, and the movie's plot focus strips away most of the pathos of the story, leaving it feeling pretty bland and hollow. Also, I'd be remiss not to mention the dialogue here. Let's just say Charlie says "liar, liar, pants on fire" at one point, and it's not even the worst line. Con number two is the editing. It takes a lot for editing to negatively stand out for me, but this film is rough through a couple sections. It actually really sneaks up on you. Things start off fine, but once we hit the first few action scenes, or at least more exciting scenes, the editing is distractingly bad. At times, it's hard to tell what's even happening because it's cut together so quickly and strangely. Similarly, some scene transitions are super weird and kind of confusingly edited together. One that really stood out to me was a scene where Andy and Charlie get in a car and they start to drive away. And the very next shot is of a car arriving someplace in the same visual path line as the previous shot. But it's not Andy and Charlie, and it's a scene that has absolutely nothing to do with what we just saw. It's not a big deal or anything, but it's one of those little things that stands out as very amateurish. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Firestarter or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you'd use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Firestarter 2.5 out of 5 paws. Although this serves as a very slight improvement over the 1984 version, with some better pacing and increased story coherency, it still remains a fairly bland and lackluster adaptation. I would recommend Firestarter to people looking for a breezy, throwaway sci-fi horror film. It's not the kind of movie many people will be overly engaged by, but it's got enough charred gore and fiery moments to be a decent background film if you're in the mood for a little horror. If you're somebody who loves the original Firestarter, this one will probably frustrate you. And if you've never seen the original Firestarter, this one probably won't impress you all that much. But if you've seen the original and thought it had a lot of room for improvement, you might be more likely to find this version okay. If you liked Firestarter, I've got to recommend the original 1984 version of Firestarter. This came out only 4 years after the book was published, and it follows the same basic story as this version, but adds another half hour of chase scenes, a lot of waiting rooms, and some wild practical effects. If you're interested in another Stephen King remake, you might want to check out the 2013 version of Carrie. Just like this film, that remake changes up some things from the original film and also focuses on a girl with volatile powers. And if you want another horror movie about a kid with powers, you should watch Brightburn. It's more of an evil supervillain origin story than this is, but has some tonal similarities and also a few unexpectedly brutal moments. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Firestarter? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, since we have enough of them now, what's your favorite Stephen King remake or readaptation? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information on this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainely Movies, the way life should be.